Hello, and welcome to episode 111 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth, historian and deputy director here at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this morning, Bill?
I'm not feeling very retired this morning, but I am retired. So from the Navy anyway. I'm doing well, thanks.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not,
I guess, yeah.
Got to keep on moving.
Yep.
But today's episode is going to be about Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King. And with that, I'm going to hand the introduction of this particular episode off to Admiral King's fellow Annapolis alum, Captain Bill Tody. Bill, take it away.
Thanks, Seth. Well, Fleet Admiral Ernest King was commander-in-chief or Comanche during most of World War II, and that's of the entire Navy fleet, Atlantic and Pacific. Now, before King became Comanche, there wasn't a Comanche. In fact, what we used to call it was Commander-in-Chief U.S. Fleet, or Sink US, or Sink Us for short, which is ludicrous. It's a ludicrous name. And King changed it to Com-Eng, Commander-in-Chief, rather than Sink Us, much higher quality. And the Sink Us title would rotate between the Atlantic Fleet Commander and the Pacific Fleet Commander, whoever of those two were senior. So, for example, before King became Comanche was the Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Husband Kimmel. And then when Kimmel was relieved and Nimitz was ordered in, well, King was senior to Nimitz. So King became Comanche and commander of both the Atlantic and, in theory, the Pacific fleets, although Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet under King. But in that capacity, King's responsibility included Europe, the Pacific, and everything else. And a funny aside on the title Commander-in-Chief, the Navy was the only service that was bold enough to assume the title of Commander-in-Chief, and it was these two Commander-in-Chief of Atlantic and Pacific titles. When King became Comanche, or Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. fleet, Roosevelt pointed out to King, as we're talking about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt right now, pointed out to King that there's only one Commander-in-Chief mentioned in the Constitution, and that's the president. So maybe, would you consider maybe not using the Commander-in-Chief title? And it says a lot about both leaders. When King decided to ignore the president and assume the Commander-in-Chief title, regardless of what the president suggested to him. And the fact that Roosevelt, as far as we know, never again made the recommendation. So the Commander-in-Chief title stuck for decades, but Navy only until Goldwater-Nichols Act was passed. And then Goldwater-Nichols named a joint commander-in-chief, not just Navy commander-in-chief of fleet, but a joint commander-in-chief, a whole bunch of them all over the world. And so then there were not one or two commander-in-chiefs, there was like a plethora, 14 or something like that. I used to visit every one of them, and I'm wearing one of the shirts I would wear during those visits. But those titles stuck until Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 2002, when he finally, once and for all, forevermore, killed the title throughout all of DOD. And so now it no longer exists.
Right.
But
it started with King.
Yeah, it really did. Yeah, with the Comanche title, although they didn't call it that until he became Comanche. Then he was added the additional duty of Chief of Naval Operations, or CNO, in 1942. The difference is the CNO runs the Navy's budget, people, and program plans, which means provide, train, and equip ships for the Navy. Whereas the Comanche job was operational command of naval forces, and the CNO job had nothing to do with the Comanche job. He just held both titles and positions. Actually, they were separated permanently when Nimitz became CNO after King. And never again would the CNO actually have operational authority, although to this day, he retains the Chief of Naval Operations title. He's actually commander of no operations,
Right.
just the Navy staff now. And that started with Nimitz. So, in King's capacity as Commanch, in King's capacity as CNO, he had authority to name fleet commanders, to assign nearly every senior flag officer position in the Navy, not only flag officers, but he also saw and approved flagship command positions. And he could do pretty much whatever he wanted to do when it comes to personnel. And he was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, along with General Marshal Arnold, Admiral Stark. As well, he was a member of the Combined Chief of Staff with our British allies. And it was the JCS that was the body that approved initiation of campaigns such as Guadalcanal. And so that's the kind of thing. But there's a lot to talk about. When people think of Admiral King, for some God only knows reason, the first thing that comes to mind was his notorious anger, his temper, isn't it, Seth?
It is. And let me preface this by going back just a bit. This is a guy who most people, and I'm not just saying most people in general, I'm talking even, students of the Pacific War don't really know a whole hell of a lot about, and they don't know the significance of his role in the Pacific War. I mean, this guy was the end all be all for everything. Everybody hangs the moniker of hero on Admiral Nimitz, and justifiably so. This cat was Nimitz's boss.
That's right.
So I mean, this guy controlled everything, and that's important to note, because everything, and I do mean literally everything that went through Nimitz's office came from Admiral Ernest J. King. But to get back to what you were saying, his temper, if you look at pictures of Ernest King, of Fleet Admiral King, I don't think I can ever recall one where he's smiling.
No, it wasn't a practice of his.
No, and he was known. We talked about earlier episodes, plural, that that Nimitz was not a blood and thunder kind of a guy. He wasn't a holler, he wasn't a screamer and a yeller. Ernest King kind of was, to an extent. Yeah, he was a guy that would make his presence immediately known when he walked in a room, mainly because of his ill temper, shall we say. And that stuck with him his entire career. It didn't just, take root when he took command of the U.S. fleet. It was his, legend, if you will, for lack of a better term, from the time the guy got out of the academy until the time he retired. He was just an ill-tempered fella. His daughter had a pretty unique saying about him that I find funny. What was that statement she made?
People said that he was hard to work for because he had such a uneven personality. He said, "What are you talking about? My father's the most even-tempered person in the world. He's always in a rage." She also said once that he shaved with a blowtorch. I mean, there's a lot of, and then there's what Eisenhower said about him. Do you remember that?
I don't, but I do know that he was not a fan of Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was not a fan of King. Well, they did not like one another at all.
The best thing Eisenhower could say about King was that Admiral King is an arbitrary, stubborn type with too much brain and a tendency towards bullying his juniors. But I think he wants to fight, which is vastly encouraging. And then after a few months of working with him, he had a somewhat more direct statement about King, didn't he?
He did. And, I think that most people that worked with King had that opinion of him, that he was very abrasive. But he was abrasive because he was trying to fight for what he wanted, and not just him personally, but what he wanted to get for the United States Navy, specifically in the Pacific Fleet, which is what, or the Pacific War, which is what our podcast is about. And obviously, he handled both the Atlantic and the Pacific, but he was a big advocate of fighting for more materiel, more, just more of everything for the Navy in the Pacific. And
he also wasn't shy to pull naval forces away from Europe and divert them to the Pacific if he thought things were stagnating in Europe. because he owned both fleets, right? So,
Right.
and that's another area where he came into conflict with Eisenhower. So, for example, Eisenhower, by the way, just to get back to my commander-in-chief comment, note that Eisenhower was not a commander-in-chief, he was Supreme Allied Commander.
Right.
So, nobody could quibble with that title. But when King kept saying, look, we need to go on the offensive in Europe and in the Pacific both, and Eisenhower, was telling him that the Brits weren't ready. The first thing they wanted to do was a North Africa campaign, and the Brits decided they weren't ready. King said, well, forget it then. And he took those naval forces that would have supported a landing in North Africa and diverted them to the Pacific. And we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
that was because Nimitz couldn't say no to him. He would say, right, we're going to do this. We're going to authorize this, get it done. Right. And so once the JCS authorized the campaign, he could order Nimitz when to start it as Comminch.
Right. And it abundantly clear is that Admiral King was a supporter of the Germany first plan. He was a supporter of that, but just as you said, he was also under the, he wasn't blind. He could see that the forces were being shunted towards Europe, but not much was happening. I mean, we're talking 1942 here. Let's be abundantly clear. We're not talking, even late 43. We're talking early 1942, where we were not ready really to put an offensive into action anywhere in the world, much less in Europe. I mean, the U-boats were running rampant all over the Atlantic, and King was starting to build forces to combat that, to his credit, but we weren't ready for any of that. Our shipbuilding program, granted, had started, as early as 1940, actually as early as 1938, but it was just starting to get ramped up. So he was pulling forces where he had them and putting them where he needed them, which at this time was in the Pacific. Yeah. And we desperately needed them in the Pacific at this time. Yep.
And, that's created some pretty strong animosity between him and Eisenhower. And Eisenhower ended up saying one thing that might help win this war, and when he says that, I think he means the war in Europe, is to get someone to shoot King. He actually said that, right? He's the antithesis of cooperation, a deliberately rude person, which means he's a mental bully. And so, yes, when King was not patient, he wanted us to take the initiative, the United States, and he was, detached from Europe enough when he was in Washington with Marshall and Hap Arnold and the president, frankly, that he said, we're sitting here doing nothing. Doing something is better than doing nothing.
Right.
So, and that's when he would get permission from the president to divert some forces.
Well, go ahead.
No, good.
I was going to say, and this is where his actions, his insistence on action really comes into play. Because, we had an episode, I believe it was 105, where we talked about the hit and run carrier raids.
Right.
That was King's idea. That a direct message from Admiral King to Admiral Nimitz 2 days after Nimitz takes command, it says, and I'm paraphrasing, that King wanted Nimitz, or is ordering Nimitz, suggesting Nimitz, that they go out and they hit Marshall Islands, Marcus Island, all these far-flung Japanese bases. This was King's idea. And he knew at this point that even with the meager forces that we had in the Pacific, we had to keep pressure on the Japanese in some way, shape, or form. And, part of it was morale building, for the fleet. Part of it was also to keep the pressure on the Japanese. Part of it was also, building the fighting team. We talked about all this in previous episodes. No need to revisit it here, but this was all King's idea. This was all his plan.
Now, as the war evolved, Nimitz took the reins on defining strategic objectives. He still got King's buy-in, no doubt about it. But early in 42, all the way through, I think through all of 1942, King was still the architect. And let the record show, it was brilliant. That it did more than anything to start turning the tide, because we've argued previously when we're talking about Midway that it wasn't so much Midway, but Guadalcanal.
Correct.
That was the point at which the tide turned for us in the Pacific. And that was Nimitz execution, but King's concept.
Absolutely.
And so he gets an enormous amount of credit for being the grand strategist that got us pointed in the right direction in the Pacific campaign.
Mm-hmm. And again, this goes back to what we talked about earlier, and that, he doesn't get enough credit for the actions that the things that he did, because, people, if you know anything about Admiral King, anything at all, which isn't much, most people don't know, is you think of him as an administrator. He's the boss. He's just the admin. He cleans the house, if you will. And that is completely untrue. He was the one that, at least as you said, Bill, 42 specifically, I'd say the whole year, all the way into 43, you talk about Operation Galvanic, when they're going into the Gilberts and Tarawa, and we'll obviously get to all that later on. This is all still Admiral King. This is him saying, this is what we're going to do. This is where we're going to go. Make it happen. And that's the beauty and the genius of Admiral King, is he knew exactly what he wanted to do, when he wanted to do it, and how to do it. Admittedly, sometimes with meager forces, but he get it done.
And, as a naval officer, I'm always fascinated by what went into a person's career that allowed them to succeed so brilliantly, or conversely fail so miserably. And we're doing a separate action. We did an episode on Nimitz with Admiral Jim Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. We did a separate Nimitz episode that we'll release some time on how Nimitz came to be the officer he was, to command the Pacific so effectively. And we talked about Nimitz's the fact that he was a submariner and really understood submarine technology, advanced diesel technology in submarines, but it was a big war college student studying the Pacific for many years and serving in the Pacific, coming to know Japan very well through his service, both as a junior officer and as a commanding officer on a cruiser. Battleship Division I, embarked in Arizona. Everything was pointing towards proficiency in battle campaign planning in the Pacific Theater of Operations, which he did brilliantly. Interestingly, there are a lot of parallels with King's background. He's also a graduate of Annapolis, as every naval officer was in those days. Started out as a surface officer, and but like Nimitz, was fascinated by submarines and actually went to submarine school. And later, the interesting thing is, unlike Nimitz, although he commanded groups of submarines, he never was assigned to a submarine. And so unlike Nimitz, he didn't do the stuff you need to do to earn your dolphins, which I earned as an ensign or a lieutenant junior grade. Nimitz also earned, it's a whole lot more than submarine school to get your gold dolphins. You have to basically memorize and be able to operate every system on the ship. And it's interesting to me that King decided he wasn't going to do that. He didn't care about, in those days, the submarine dolphins predated pilot wings. Pilots didn't have wings yet. The only chest insignia that existed in the United States Navy was the submarine dolphin. So for somebody to go to submarine school, by the way, he went as a captain, the only captain in a class full of ensigns. To somebody go through submarine school and then decide, okay, but I'm not going to do the work to earn my dolphins, is kind of interesting to me. But it is. It does talk about he was a very ambitious naval officer, and he ran into some trouble too as a young officer, didn't he? He did.
I kind of feel a little bit of kinship to Admiral King, is that he was a drinker, as am I. I'm not going to lie. I'll be abundantly clear. Admiral King was a fan of the booze, and even before he was Admiral King, he was a fan of the booze. And he kind of ran into trouble. He showed up. Was it to his ship?
That's correct. Yeah.
Or to a station. I can't remember.
I think it was USS Cincinnati.
Yeah. He was blasted. He was loaded. And that is not you want to show up, report to duty.
And then,
for
and then he
anything,
argued with the captain over the severity of his drunkenness.
Yeah.
As a lieutenant, he's arguing with the captain. This is the kind of person he was.
Yeah, and you're going to lose that argument every single time, man.
Yeah.
You're never going to win that. But he's a man, he's a human, he's got his flaws and he had his vices, and alcohol was one. It was rumored that women were another one of his vices.
Yeah.
He was known to be a womanizer, especially during his time in Washington D.C. pre Pearl Harbor, and then even after Pearl Harbor, he had some dalliances with several females in the area. And hey, you do what you do. But
yeah, that drunk incident though did result in a reprimand, and it would have ramifications for decades later in ways you would never have imagined. Because jumping ahead to 1945, the captain of USS Indianapolis, Charles Butler McVeigh, was court-martialed. The rumor started that the person who had reprimanded King was McVeigh's father, Admiral Charles B. McVeigh Jr., who was commander of the Asiatic Fleet at one point in his career. But as it turns out, he was not commander of Asiatic Fleet when King was reprimanded yet. People were using the story, the untrue story, the myth that McVeigh's father is the one who reprimanded King, and King's court-martial of McVeigh was vendetta against King's father. Right. McVeigh's father, I'm sorry.
Right.
Which made absolutely no sense. And by the way, historically, the timing didn't work. But back in those days, pre-internet, when those accusations were being made, I think it would have been pretty difficult to find out precisely when King's reprimand occurred and precisely who on that date was commander of the Asiatic Fleet. And it wasn't McVeigh's father.
Right. But that rumor persists to this day, but it's completely untrue. King had no vendetta against McVeigh at all, because he approved McVeigh to be the flagship commander.
Of USS Indianapolis. Since it was a flagship, King had to approve the assignment of McVeigh to that flagship. If he, as flagship CEO, if he had any vendetta against McVeigh, he would have just said, send McVeigh to another ship. And nobody would have ever known.
Right.
But he approved him for the most, respected, marquee command assignment in in the Navy.
Of the Pacific Fleet.
Fifth Fleet flagship, right?
Yeah.
And so the notion, I don't know, I don't think we'll ever kill this rumor that King had a vendetta against McVeigh. Now, we're going to talk about the court-martial in a little while, but let's kill the vendetta issue now. Yeah,
it was completely, as you said, ludicrous. It wasn't, that wasn't the case. But getting back to King, a little bit of a brief bio on him before we start getting into a little bit more of the things that he orchestrated we'll say pre-Tarawa. I don't want to get too terribly far down the line, but because we're going to revisit King in probably every episode we do.
Yeah.
But he was an aviator too. Aside from being, going to sub school, he got his wings of gold, and he was a captain too at that point, was he not?
When he 49 years old. Yeah. This is after submarine school. He said, okay, these carriers, they look like they're really something. This may be the future.
Yeah. And which, is ironic, because in the early part of the Pacific War, he was an advocate for using the battle wagons against the Japanese fleet, but he also pushed for carriers. So it was kind of a weird thing. But the fact of the matter remains is that he could see the future, in 1927 is when he got his wings. Isn't that true?
Yeah. I would say, though, the story isn't quite as altruistic as it sounds, because King, you said earlier that King was known as an administrator. And what I was going to say was that he was thought of that way even when he was a pre-flag officer, when he was a non-flag officer earlier in his career. He, very ambitious, kept fighting for top-notch at-sea command.
Mhm.
And he kept getting sent to these, what he would consider administrative roles.
Mhm.
He kept getting, anytime a submarine sunk, and sadly back in those days, this happened way too often, he would be the guy they'd divert out to take charge of the salvage effort.
Mhm.
That's not command of a ship.
Right.
They gave him command of a submarine flotilla, and he thought that was not command of a ship, and it's not going to help me get promoted. And so when he started looking, he kept asking for a cruiser command, and they kept saying, yeah, later, later, later. And then he saw these aircraft carriers and thought, maybe what I want to do is command one of those. And he talked to, I think it was Admiral Moffett, who commanded naval aviation at the day. And what do I have to do to get command of an aircraft carrier? Well, you need to be a pilot.
Got to be a pilot. Yeah.
So he went to Pensacola, and these guys who went to flight school late in their careers, the guys that were started out as aviators, as ensigns, called the old guys that went to flight school when they were captains, Johnny come latelys. So he was clearly a Johnny come lately, but he did unlike going to submarine school and not getting the dolphins,
right,
he did what he needed to do to get his pilot's wings, to have credibility for when he was hoping to take command of an aircraft carrier. And he did eventually get command of a carrier, right?
He did. He got command of USS Lexington, CV2.
The second, yeah.
Yeah, he got command of the second fleet. Well, really, technically the first fleet carrier of the United States Navy, but the second carrier built for the United States Navy,
right.
USS Lexington, converted battle cruiser. She was commissioned in 27, and he took command, I believe, in 1930. So he got command of her for pretty early on in the ship's career, and then he stayed with Lex for quite a while, and he was captain when a lot of the guys that you see or hear about later in the beginning of the Pacific War, like especially at Coral Sea, they served under. Yeah. They were, and I'm talking like squadron commanders, not not ensigns, but like Bob Dixon, Bill Alt, people like that who were at Coral Sea flying off of Lexington. They had served under Admiral King at some point when King was
JOs,
Well, King was CEO of Lexington. He, and that's something too. We talked about, we had a Coral Sea episode. We talked about the sinking of Lex, and King felt that one close to his heart. When Lex went down, because that was his ship. That was his first major command. I mean, that's commanding Lexington is a big deal.
Right. Yeah. So let's jump back to King's impact on
the war.
On the war, yeah. I think that the island hopping campaign seems so axiomatic looking back, right? It seems like so obvious,
right?
That we'll take one step at a time and use them as jumping off points for the next step and the next step. But it wasn't that obvious at the time, right? And this isn't the first thing that came to mind when we realized we were going to have to start an offensive against Japan. What other kind of ideas were people kicking around at the time?
Well, old Dugout Doug was pushing for an action in the South Pacific, which of course he does get because he's MacArthur. But truthfully, I mean, it was a needed action. But the beauty part of the island hopping campaign is that they being the United States, were going to skip over those heavily defended islands, such as or places like Rabaul and Truk, and cut them off from Japanese supply, cut them off basically from everything, and let them, like if you can imagine a cluster of grapes on a vine, you cut that off and you just let the grapes wither there on the vine. That's how the United States looked at some of these hardened defensive islands that the Japanese had. King was the architect and Nimitz was the advocate. He was also an architect of the island hopping campaign, that being Nimitz, of course. But it was King's baby. It was his brainchild to jump over these islands because he wanted to keep the pressure on Japan. After the Guadalcanal campaign ends and we emerge victorious, it was a pretty obvious, seen that we had the upper hand at this point in the Pacific War, and he wanted to keep that pressure on the Japanese all the way to Tokyo, because his ultimate goal, of course, was, and we've said this before too, was to get within striking range of the Japanese home islands with our Army Air Force's heavy bombers, which of course meant we had to take islands in the Marianas. But I mean, again, if you look at the operational history, it's literally, it leapfrogs. It goes boom, 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 all the way from Pearl Harbor, all the way to the Marianas, and then the Philippines, and then so on and so on and so on. Yeah. But that's all Admiral King's brainchild. That's all his plan. That was all his architectural design for the Pacific War, if you will. And it all started, really, frankly, it started with Guadalcanal, even though Guadalcanal wasn't necessarily part of the island hopping campaign, if you will. It became that later. But it was King who was the one that said, after Midway, hey, look, Midway bought us this precious amount of time. We don't necessarily have the upper hand, but presently we have the initiative. And he wanted to push the matter against the Japanese. He wanted to keep the pressure on them. He wanted to take some sort of offensive action in the Pacific theater. You talked about earlier, taking resources away from Europe. And again, let's be clear, the resources he was taking away from Europe, they weren't really a whole hell of a lot of material, but anything that he took out of the European campaign and threw into the Pacific campaign was met with, people running around with their hair on fire. And he took what he had to and put it in the Pacific. And Admiral King, was the architect of Operation Watchtower, which of course is the operation against Guadalcanal.
Right. I'm going to use a metaphor here that's going to not make sense to you when I use it, but I'm also, I've always loved the space program and nominated for astronaut myself, but failed. But when Apollo 13 failed, when that explosion occurred in the service module of Apollo 13, one of the flight directors, I can't remember which one it was, the first question out of his mouth was, what exactly on the spacecraft still works? They had to figure out a plan to get the astronauts home with what works. So it's a kind of a weird a different way to look at the problem, but it was an effective way to look at the problem. I think after Pearl Harbor, King was looking at what was left in the Pacific Fleet and saying to himself, okay, now what still works in the spacecraft, in the Pacific Fleet?
Right.
And what can we do with what we have left? And of course, Nimitz said almost exactly those words on the day he took command. I think it was New Year's Eve of Pacific Fleet. He said almost exactly those words to reporters. We're going to do what we can with what we have left, or something like that, the best we can with what we have left. And so this was the island hopping campaign, from my point of view, at least early on, was a strategy of desperation. And I know that sounds bad, but that's not bad, because we didn't have much. It was one of the very few courses of action we had left to us.
Right.
It was the best of a lot of bad alternatives. But it was brilliantly executed. And that's the thing we keep coming back to. The other name for the Guadalcanal campaign, the joking name for it, was what? Again?
Operation Shoestring.
Yeah. Operation Shoestring.
Yeah, shoestring budget,
Exactly right. We had shoestring forces, we had shoestring logistics and shoestring supplies.
Shoestring intelligence. I mean,
just barely enough to get it done. And that happened often throughout each of these little battles. We would barely get enough to take the next step. And we had to make a decision. Should we wait and build more forces and have more margin? Well, margin is extra, reserve to make sure we succeed. Well, that also gives the Japanese more time to prepare their defenses. And the defense has the advantage when it comes to a set amount of time.
Right.
Right. So you got to move early and get aggressive and decide when we have 51% success, right? Probability of success.
We barely had that.
Yeah. And then now we got to move.
Yeah.
And we have 50. Go ahead.
he was the pusher for this. He was the designer for Guadalcanal, and this is a perfect segue to the topics that we're going to talk about in the next several episodes. Is the turning point of the war, this campaign around Guadalcanal. But it was Admiral King was the one that said, "This is what we're going to do. This is how I want to do it. Make it happen." And as I mean, obviously, he didn't say it that easily, but that's essentially what he wanted to do, was get some action in the South Pacific and strike at an island or a group of islands. In this particular case, it was actually a group: Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Florida, Tanambogo Islands, all around in that little cluster area. And that was to basically seal off the Japanese. And he pushed for this operation, within several, like, I want to say 2, 3, 4 weeks after the victory at Guadalcanal. So it's middle of July. He gets the hair up his backside, says, "This is what we're going to do, and this is what the forces that we're going to use, and make it happen." And he's, if you really look at it, while I understand why he wanted to do it and why he wanted to do it then, it probably should have waited. Honestly, it probably should have waited. I mean, the only real ground forces he's throwing at this operation are 2 Marine Corps regiments: the fifth regiment and the first Marines and 5th Marines are the Marines that land on Guadalcanal on August 7th. The 7th Marines do come, but they come, much later. They come in, September or late September, early October. They come. I forget the exact date, but they come later. So, I mean, you only got really 2 Marine rifle regiments and some accompanying artillery that land on Guadalcanal to capture this island and hold it. And it, General Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, was blindsided with this, order. And he ultimately says, like, "We're not ready for this. We don't have the logistics. We don't have the supplies. We don't have the support. We don't have the men." The 1st Marine Division was all the way on the East Coast at this time. They were in New River, North Carolina. Camp Lejeune hadn't been built yet. So, I mean, they're still way the hell over on the other side of the country. They had really, frankly, as well-trained as the Marine Corps is, they had not been really well-trained for this type of operation. They didn't know what the hell they were getting into.
They're still evolving amphibious doctrine. Yep.
Very much so. And then 2, the Navy, who has to support all of this stuff. Yeah, we won at Midway and technically won at Coral Sea, but by the skin of our teeth, man, by the skin of our teeth. We're the only operational carriers we have in the Pacific are Enterprise, Saratoga, and Hornet. And Saratoga just got back from the yard in the early part of June. She just barely missed Midway, but she's there now. She's in the Pacific now. But I mean, again, we don't have a whole hell of a lot of surface forces to deal with whatever threat may come our way. We have a lot of cruisers and we have a lot of destroyers, but we have no major, floating gun platforms and battleships I'm talking about here that are capable or ready to be sent out to Guadalcanal at this time. So the forces were air forces. Hell, we didn't have hardly any air support. The only air support that the Marines would have on August 7th, 42 were flying off the flight decks of Enterprise and Saratoga, and later the Wasp, she comes in there. But I mean, it's a meager forces. And, one can understand why King wanted to push the issue, but as they say, hindsight's 2020. You look at the results of what came out of it, at least in the beginning, and the razor's edge of victory and defeat that we kind of teetered on for 3 months, and he probably should have waited a little while,
And from the Navy's standpoint, of course, we don't want to do the entire Guadalcanal episode today, but the Navy's was mostly a logistics mission to support the Marines ashore. And in order to do that, you need command of the seas. And we didn't have command of the seas.
No.
And as we would learn in Savo Island, we weren't even close to getting it. And
Not
so
even close.
But we learned so much from that campaign. You're right. I think we started too early. As the Marines suffered greatly. They certainly led the Navy in misery index during Guadalcanal, but the Navy actually led in loss of life with the sinkings of several ships and Iron Bottom Sound. The reason it's called Iron Bottom Sound.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's just but the notion of getting Guadalcanal was correct. It was just probably a little earlier. And from the timing standpoint, they learned that as well.
For sure.
And then King's high-level objectives were to neutralize Japan's Navy, because he saw the Navy as a center of gravity and understood enough about carrier warfare to know the carriers were going to be central to the neutralization of the Navy, Japanese Navy. The second one would be to isolate and strangle mainland Japan in a slow strangulation move by using submarines to sink anything that they could sink going into and out of Japan. And this meant unrestricted submarine warfare. Major point here is that was still against international law when we decided to do it. In fact, it wasn't, I don't think, this was done intentionally, I suspect, but the president was never formally asked to authorize unrestricted submarine warfare. So King kind of just made that decision, much like MacArthur making the decision for the president, I shall return to the Philippines, right? But it was necessary to isolate Japan. So that was the second objective, isolate and strangle mainland Japan. And the third one was seize islands that would enable the strategic bombing campaign to put further pressure. And of course, the seizing islands bit was the joint Navy Marine Corps. And then later, Navy, Marine, Army operations, but initially Navy and Marine. So
King made it abundantly clear, when he said this specifically when talking about the island hopping campaign post Guadalcanal, 1943. This is just before Tarawa, when he was talking about the Central Pacific Drive, which is what beat the Japanese in World War II. Abundantly clear. He said that it was going to be a Navy and Marine Corps show. And it, for all intents and purposes, was. Yes, the Army was there, obviously, but it was driven by the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps, and King made that abundantly clear. So
remember, at this point in time, the Marine Corps didn't have a 4-star, was not a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're talking about 1942 right now.
Right.
And they were roughly subordinated to the Navy. They were in the Department of Navy. Sure. They weren't a co-equal service with the Navy, as happened after the 1947 Defense Authorization Act, I think. But go ahead.
And he made it abundantly clear that this is how he was going to conduct the war in the Pacific. And this is something, we talked very, very briefly about. Well, we didn't talk briefly. We talked about his attitude and his abrasive behavior and the way he just said, this is how I want to get this done. And this is how it's going to get done. Boom, mic drop, walk out the room. This is it. And if you don't like it, there's the door. He really irritated the Brits with this whole, this is going to be a Navy Marine Corps show across the Central Pacific Drive, because he made it abundantly clear that it's not necessarily that they didn't want the British help, but he was also not stupid in that he realized that the main British effort was in Europe for obvious reasons. It was in the European theater and not the Pacific theater. The Americans had the teeth to get this done in the Pacific theater. So he not so, quietly left the British out of their plans, out of his plans. And you don't see any major British land operation at all through the Central Pacific Drive. You see the British Pacific Fleet show up and in 45, and there was some of their armored deck aircraft carriers. And, that's another story for another day, but that's way late in the war when, essentially the issue had already been decided. But yeah, he makes it abundantly clear that this is going to be an American show. In the Pacific, this is going to be a United States Navy, United States Marine Corps show. Yes, the Army will be there, but this is how it's going to be run.
And the Royal Australian Navy did what they could too.
For sure. Yeah, and you see that at places like Guadalcanal and Coral Sea and further operations later on. Yeah. But King, he really put his foot down. He put his stamp on this. The entire Pacific Drive from 1942, from the time Nimitz gets into office until the time the Japanese sign the surrender on the Missouri, it's got King's fingerprints all over every single part of it.
Yeah, so it's so sad that when people bring up King's name, the first thing that comes to mind is his personality, his anger issues, or whatever you want to call them in modern lexicon. Right. Because he was the major strategist thinking globally for naval operations, which were absolutely required to enable everything that happened on land in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy. You know, if you didn't have command of the seas, then and didn't overcome the U-boat threat, then nothing else we did would have worked. And he was the fleet commander that made all that happen while simultaneously making sure that we pressured Japan early and kept the win-to-lose ratio where it needed to be to accelerate the Pacific campaign. So he was right about almost anything, everything, I would say. He was wrong about the way he treated people. And there's one more thing I've argued for decades he was wrong about, and that was the McVeigh affair.
Right.
And there's a nuance here. I said earlier that King didn't create this court-martial in order to cause McVeigh's father to suffer. And that's true.
Yeah, it wasn't a vendetta. Yeah.
No, it wasn't a vendetta. Could not have been. In parallel with that, though, after the USS Indianapolis was sunk, July 30th, 1945, and then the recovery occurred August 4th, 5th, 6th, rescue and recovery in 1945. Admiral Nimitz, who is the Pacific Fleet commander, convened a court of inquiry in Guam in August, within a month of the sinking and the rescue, August 1945. And the court of inquiry recommended McVeigh be court-martialed. In my opinion, there were some procedural violations in that court of inquiry that caused it to be defective. But the court of inquiry reported to the person that convened it, who was Nimitz. And Nimitz was required by naval regulation to forward it on to the final determination authority, who was the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, via King. And in Nimitz's endorsement to the Court of Inquiry findings and recommendations, Nimitz disagreed with the Court of Inquiry's decision or recommendation to court-martial McVeigh and put that in writing. It went to King. King conferred with Forrestal and with Forrestal's senior general counsel, who decades later, as I recall, would become Secretary of the Navy himself. But Forrestal, the three of them convened, and some weird things happened, and King ended up supporting the notion of court-martial, not because he was trying to punish McVeigh's father.
Right.
We've completely ruled that motive out. And it is unclear why he and Forrestal was the one who had the authority, decided to support the court-martial. And then, in fact, once the court-martial occurred and McVeigh was convicted, Forrestal set aside, and canceled, nullified McVeigh's punishment. So McVeigh was never punished for the court-martial, although the conviction remained in his service record. So why support a court-martial and then completely set aside the findings of the court-martial? Why not? I think King's inclination was to go with the recommendations of the Court of Inquiry. Other people have speculated that King was trying to protect, the war was now over, and King was trying to protect the very same admirals in the Pacific Fleet that he was about to turn into heroes for our victory. That's actually one of the books, the last book that came out on the Indianapolis affair. That's their theory. Whatever it was wrong to convict McVeigh, wrong to court-martial, wrong to bring the charges. And that's one of the greatest regrets I have about Admiral King. And what about you?
Well, aside from that, and I agree with you, what you just said about that about McVeigh, that it was not the man's fault that the ship was torpedoed. And it was certainly not his fault that, his crew languished in the water for days.
Mhm.
It was not his fault. And I know we're going to do an episode on the Indianapolis, rightfully so,
Right.
and we'll get deep into the detail there for sure.
Mhm.
But to suffice it to say, it was not the man's fault, and Admiral King made a mistake there. However, aside from that, what I'd already said about Guadalcanal, and we're gonna
The timing.
we're fixing to dive into Guadalcanal here in the next
Mhm.
several episodes. That is something that I could definitely fault him with, is that not necessarily the notion of doing it, it's the notion of doing it then. We
Mhm.
were not ready. We weren't. But on the flip side of that, you got to get something moving, and that's what he saw.
Mhm.
I don't think anybody, certainly not Admiral King, could have foreseen all the action that would take place in the air, on the land, in the seas around Guadalcanal. I mean, nobody had a crystal ball. I'm sure he was fully aware that the Japanese would respond, but to the degree that they would respond,
that the Emperor Hirohito would get personally involved in their reluctance to disengage. Who could foresee that?
Nobody could. I mean, would the Japanese respond? For sure. Would they eventually? This is the hill that they're going to die on. Are they going to respond to that degree? Nobody could see that coming.
No.
We wanted the battle of attrition because we're ultimately always going to win that battle against the Japanese. But I don't think they expected it to be right here, right then and there. Had Admiral King known that, had he had, and I talked about, we had poor intelligence in Guadalcanal. For all the great intelligence that we had at Coral Sea, hit and run raids, Doolittle raid, Midway, the intelligence around Guadalcanal in August 1942 was piss poor, to put it blunt. And it just, had he known the things that, had he had better intelligence, I don't think he would have pulled the trigger on Guadalcanal right then. Would he have done it later? Yeah, probably so. But would he have done it on August 7th, 1942? No, he wouldn't have. I find fault with him there. But aside from that, I really can't, I mean, everything else he orchestrated, planned, executed, worked.
Right, yeah.
It really did.
Yep. So he's wrong about McVeigh. He was wrong about the way he treated his people, and he was wrong about the timing on Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
But he was right about all the major muscle movements that were required to win the Pacific War. And that's why the title of this episode is Admiral King was right about almost everything.
Yeah, very, very true. And I think that's a perfect way to wrap this particular episode up. We're going to revisit Admiral King in almost every single episode we do in one way, shape, or form. You can't. Yeah. And again, that's the importance of doing this specific episode, is that people need to understand the importance of the man, his role in the Pacific War, what he did, and just everything that his fingers touched, which was literally everything. It was everything. And with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. If you do like what we had to say, please follow us and subscribe to our podcast, the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcasts, and give us a rating and review. And please do give us a rating and review. Again, I said this in an earlier episode, they're coming in, but we would appreciate more, because this is how people find our show. Bill and I put a lot of time and effort and passion into this, and we'd like more people to hear it. So the more people that like and subscribe, the more people that pass on our show by word of mouth, it helps us out. With that, I also want to say that if you want to watch the video version of this very episode or any of our other episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel called Unauthorized History of the Pacific War Podcast. Look us up on Facebook, like and subscribe to our page there as well. You'll get automatic notifications as to when the episodes air on your podcast platforms and on YouTube. If you have a question or comment, suggestion, anything like that, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, I'm Seth Paradin. I want to thank you very much for listening. Bill?
I'm Bill Tody, retired Navy captain. Thanks again. And we're looking for our first milestone, which is 1,000 downloads. So please share with your friends, and I hope you like the episode.
Cool. All right. We'll see you all next week. Thanks.